The card came on the finest paper, and Damon Ashcombe, the Iron Duke of Drakemoor, had watched a great many men crumble in his time, but he had never before seen cruelty disguised so prettily as courtesy. He stood in the long gallery of the Ashby townhouse, where the autumn light fell thin and gold through the tall windows, and he observed, for observing was his gift, the thing that had made him feared in 3 kingdoms, the precise moment a young woman read an insult and chose to flinch. She was across the room, half-shadowed by a marble pillar, and she held the engraved invitation in gloved hands that did not shake. Around her the assembly murmured and rustled, the great drawing-room of Lady Ashby's afternoon reception thick with the perfume of hothouse lilies and the low hum of gossip that always followed the Duke wherever he went. He had come only to satisfy a creditor's son who fancied himself a host, and he had intended to leave within the half-hour. He did not leave. He watched the woman by the pillar instead, because something in the line of her spine had caught him the way a blade catches the light, and he could not look away. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room, though she was lovely in a quiet, unfashionable way, dark hair dressed simply, a gown of dove grey that had been good once, and was now merely respectable, a face too still and too proud for the chattering company around her. She was beautiful the way a winter morning is beautiful, severe and clean and unwilling to be pitied, and she was being pitied. He saw that at once. He saw the women near her exchange glances over their fans, saw the careful cruelty of their sympathy, saw how they leaned together to whisper, and then drew apart to watch her face. The Duke moved a half-step nearer to the cluster of matrons who stood gossiping by the refreshment table, not because he wished to join them, but because he wished to hear. "Sent her an invitation, if you can credit it," one was saying, a stout woman in puce, "to the wedding. To his wedding, mind, after he threw her over not a 12-month past. Lord Asherton means it as a kindness, I'm told, but I'd sooner be struck." "A kindness," another scoffed. "He means it as a triumph. He wants the whole of society to see her sit and smile while he marries Miss Caro's £40,000. There's no kindness in it. There's only spite dressed in lace." "And she'll go," the first said, with the relish of a woman who has never herself been humbled. "She must go. To refuse would be to admit the wound. She has no choice but to sit there and be looked at and pretend it does not cut her to the bone. Poor Lenora Sarah. There was a time she might have had any man in the county, and now look, now she is a cautionary tale told to younger sisters." Lenora Sarah. The Duke turned the name over in his mind as a jeweller turns a stone to the light. He looked again at the woman by the pillar, and he understood now what he was seeing. He understood the stillness. It was not coldness as he had first supposed, it was discipline. It was the iron a person forges when the world has decided to break them and they have decided not to be broken. He knew that iron. He had cast it in his own forge, long ago, in a house full of grief and ambition, and he recognized it now in a stranger across a crowded room with the queer, unsettling shock of recognizing one's own face in a glass. He was the Iron Duke. They called him that for the cold campaigns he had run as a younger man, for the ruthlessness with which he had restored a fortune his late father had nearly drowned in cards, for the way he conducted himself in the great halls of power, as though emotion were a luxury for lesser men. They called him that, and they were not entirely wrong, and he had let them believe it because a reputation, properly kept, was the cheapest armor a man could buy. He had buried his elder brother and his mother within a single brutal winter. He had taken a dukedom built on debt and shame, and made it formidable through nothing but will. He did not believe in tenderness. He believed in obligation, in honor, in the long cold arithmetic of survival. He had not believed in anything resembling longing for a very long time, and yet he could not stop looking at Lenora Sarah. Across the room, a man approached her. The Duke marked him at once for the kind of creature he most despised, handsome in the soft, untested way of men who have never had to earn anything, golden-haired and pink with wine and his own self-regard. Lord Asherton, he surmised, the bridegroom himself, the very man who had cast this woman off, and then summoned her to witness her own replacement. He came toward her with an expression of arranged sorrow, a hand pressed to his breast as though grief were a coat he had put on for the occasion. The Duke was too far to hear all of it, but he could read the shape of it. He watched Asherton bow over her hand. He watched the man's mouth move in honeyed phrases, watched the small theatrical sigh, watched him gesture, yes, toward a glittering young woman in a gown the color of new gold, who stood across the room laughing too loudly with a circle of admirers, the bride. Miss Carrow and her £40,000. Asherton was introducing his discarded betrothed to the woman he had thrown her over for, and he was doing it in the middle of a crowded room, and he was smiling. The Duke felt something move in him that he had thought long dead. It was not pity. He had no use for pity. It was a feeling that flattered the giver and shamed the recipient, and he had been on the receiving end of it once and had sworn never again. This was colder and older and far more dangerous. It was the old hunger to set a thing right, the thing that had made him a terror in the courts and the markets, the instinct that had never once in his life been roused by a woman. He watched Lenora Sayer lift her chin and answer Asherton in some quiet phrase that wiped the satisfaction briefly from the man's face. He could not hear it, but he saw its effect, saw the flicker of irritation, saw Asherton's smile tighten at the corners. So she had teeth. Good. He had begun to fear she would simply endure, and there was something in him that could not bear the thought of so fine a creature merely enduring. But the rally cost her, he saw that too. When Asherton at last bowed and withdrew, satisfied he had done his cruel work, Lenora Sayer stood alone by her pillar, and for one unguarded instant the iron in her face cracked, and the Duke saw the wound beneath it, raw and deep and shamefully exposed in that golden glittering room. She thought no one was watching, everyone was watching, and no one was watching, which is the particular torment of the publicly disgraced, surrounded, and utterly alone. She set down the invitation on the marble ledge beside her, as though it had grown too heavy. Then she turned, with composure that must have cost her everything, and made for the doors. The Duke had spent his life acting on cold calculation, and he could not afterward say what calculation moved him then, for there was none. He simply crossed the room. He was not a man who crossed rooms. Rooms emptied before him. People came to him, summoned by his rank and his reputation, and the cold gravity of his presence. The assembly noticed at once that the Iron Duke of Drakemoor, who had spoken to no one and acknowledged no one, was moving with deliberate purpose toward the doorway through which the disgraced Miss Sayer was attempting to escape. A hush spread before him like a wake. Fans paused. Conversations died mid-word. He reached the doorway a half-step before she did, and he stopped, and he bowed, not the small careless bow a great man gives a nobody, but a full, deliberate, almost ceremonial inclination, the kind of bow he would give a duchess, the kind of bow the entire room could not fail to see and could not fail to understand. Lenora Sayer stopped. She looked up at him, and the Duke found himself, for the first time in a great many years, at a loss for what to say. Her eyes were grey, like her gown, like the winter light. They were red-rimmed but dry, and they regarded him with a wariness that was almost an accusation. She did not know him, or rather she knew of him as everyone knew of him, the dark legend of Drakemoor, the man mothers used to frighten ambitious daughters. He saw her take in the height of him, the breadth of him, the severity of a face that strangers found forbidding. He saw her brace herself, certain that he had come, like all the others, to look at her ruin. "You are leaving," he said. His voice was low and even and carried further than he intended, so that the nearest watchers heard it. Before the music. Surely Lady Ashby's musicians deserve a fairer judge than this company. It was nothing. It was a piece of meaningless courtesy. But he had pitched it for the room as much as for her, and the room heard it, and the room understood that something extraordinary was unfolding, that the Iron Duke of Drakemoor had crossed a crowded drawing room to detain a ruined woman at the door, and had spoken to her as though she were the only person of consequence present. Lenora Sayer studied him for a long moment. He could see her trying to find the trap in it, the cruelty, the joke, for the world had taught her recently and thoroughly that kindness from a stranger was only cruelty wearing a better coat. He did not blame her. He would have suspected it too. "Your Grace is mistaken," she said at last, and her voice was lower than he had expected, with a faint roughness in it that he found he liked enormously. "I am not leaving on account of the music. I am leaving because I find I have outstayed my welcome in this particular company. I would not have you trouble yourself." "It is no trouble." He held her gaze. "And you mistake me, Miss Sayer. I do not trouble myself for anyone. I am the most selfish man in 3 counties. You may ask anyone here, and they will confirm it gladly. If I have crossed this room, it is entirely for my own amusement, and you would be doing me a great service by not depriving me of it too soon." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile. She was too guarded for that, too freshly wounded, but the ghost of one, a flicker of something that was almost surprise, almost the dangerous beginning of being understood. He had let her see, in those few words, that he knew exactly what was being done to her in this room, and that he found it as contemptible as she did, and that he had crossed the room precisely so that the watching crowd would see a duke choose her. "You know my name," she observed quietly. "I make it my business to know everything in any room I enter," the duke replied. "It is a tedious habit and has cost me a great deal of pleasant ignorance. I know, for instance, that you have just been introduced to your former betrothed's bride in the middle of a public assembly, and that you bore it with a great deal more grace than the occasion deserved, and that not one person in this gilded menagerie has had the decency or the courage to stand beside you while it was done." He paused. "I find I have a low tolerance for cowardice, Miss Sayer. It is among my few principles." She was silent. The grey eyes searched his face, and he let her search it, holding still beneath that examination as he had held still beneath the scrutiny of kings. Whatever she found there, and he did not himself know what was written on his face in that moment, for he had lost his usual command of it. It made her hesitate at the threshold of her escape. "And so," she said slowly, "you have crossed the room, to be seen standing beside the woman everyone is whispering about. Have you considered, Your Grace, that you are only making yourself ridiculous, that tomorrow they will whisper about you instead?" "They whisper about me already," the Duke said. "They have whispered about me for 15 years. I find I have grown rather fond of the sound. It keeps the foolish at a distance and saves me a great deal of conversation I would otherwise be obliged to endure." He offered his arm, not insistently, but as a fact, a thing simply placed in the world for her to accept or refuse. "Permit me to see you to your carriage, Miss Sayer. If only so that the entire room may watch us go, and spend the rest of the afternoon entirely failing to understand what they have witnessed. It would please me enormously to confuse them." For a long moment she did not move. He had time to think that he had misjudged it, that he had presumed too far, that she would refuse him and walk out alone, and he would have made a spectacle of them both for nothing. He found that he did not want her to refuse. The wanting was unfamiliar and faintly alarming, and he held himself very still around it the way a man holds still around a wound he is not yet ready to examine. Then Lenora Sayer lifted her chin and looked once deliberately back across the room, back at Lord Asherton, who had turned to watch with his golden bride upon his arm, and an expression of dawning, gratifying confusion spreading across his soft, handsome face, and she laid her gloved hand upon the arm of the Iron Duke of Drakemoor. "You may," she said, "though I warn you, Your Grace, I am no longer in the habit of trusting a gentleman's kindness. I have had cause to learn what it is worth." "Then we shall do very well together," the Duke said, "for I am no gentleman at all. Come, let us disappoint them." And he led her out, through the parting crowd, beneath the gold autumn light, and behind them the great drawing room erupted at last into the roar of scandalized speculation, and Damon Ashcombe, who had not felt the quickening of his own heart in longer than he could remember, felt it then, and was troubled, and did not let it show. He thought of her for the rest of that day, and through a sleepless night, and through the cold grey dawn that found him standing at the tall windows of Drakemoor's London house with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. This was not his habit. The Iron Duke did not think of women. He had been pursued by the most ambitious matrons in the kingdom for 15 years, paraded before their daughters at every ball and dinner, and he had remained as unmoved as a granite cliff before the tide. He had supposed himself simply made of colder stuff than other men. He had not supposed himself capable of lying awake, remembering the precise grey of a stranger's eyes, and the rough catch in her voice when she said she no longer trusted a gentleman's kindness. By the time the city stirred fully into morning, he had done what he always did when confronted by a problem he did not understand. He had set about learning everything there was to know about it. What he learned, over the following days, assembled itself into a story that hardened his strange new resolve into something like iron. He sent quiet inquiries through the discreet channels available to a man of his rank and patience, and the answers came back, and they painted a portrait of a woman more wronged than even the gossiping matrons had supposed. Lenora Sayer was the only daughter of the late Sir Edmund Sayer, a baronet of ancient name and modest means, a man more interested in his library and his orchards than in the cold game of advancement. He had loved his daughter and raised her to be honest, which in the harsh accounting of society was very nearly a cruelty. She had grown into a young woman admired for her wit and her music and the steady warmth of her character, and at 21 she had become engaged, with every appearance of mutual affection, to Lord Frederick Asherton, the heir to a viscountcy and a man considered, then, to be quite in love with her. For a year they had been the toast of their county. The Duke read the accounts of it with a curious tightening in his chest. The picnics, the assemblies, the long courtship conducted in full and approving view of a society that had decided to be charmed. Lenora Sayer had been happy. She had been, by every account, openly and trustingly in love, which is to say she had made herself entirely vulnerable, as the honest always do. And then Sir Edmund had died, suddenly, of a failure of the heart, and in the cold settling of his affairs it emerged that the estate was burdened with debts he had concealed even from his daughter. Not ruinous debts, but enough to reduce Lenora's expectations from comfortable to slender. She would have her good name and a small competence and very little else. Lord Asherton had discovered, at almost the same moment, that a Miss Henrietta Carow, the daughter of a coal magnate of vast and vulgar fortune, had developed a tender for him, £40,000. A coal fortune wanted a title to launder it respectable, and a viscount's heir with expensive habits and a thinning purse wanted £40,000, and the arithmetic was as cold and simple as anything the Duke had ever calculated in his own ledgers. Asherton had broken the engagement within a month of Sir Edmund's funeral. He had done it, moreover, in the cruelest manner available to him, not privately, not with the decent fiction of mutual agreement that allows a jilted woman to keep her dignity, but publicly, letting it be understood throughout the county that he had escaped a clever fortune hunter who had concealed her father's ruin to trap him. He had made Lenora, the wronged, the bereaved, the betrayed, into the villain of her own abandonment. He had needed her to be the guilty party, the Duke understood, because a man cannot be a scoundrel if his victim was a schemer, and Asherton had a tender regard for his own reputation. So she had lost, within a single season, her father, her fortune, her betrothed, and her good name, and she had borne the whole of it without once descending to the public weeping or recrimination that would have confirmed the slander. She had held her head up. She had attended the assemblies she could not afford to refuse. She had endured the pity and the whispers and the slow social demotion from celebrated beauty to cautionary tale, and she had done it with the iron composure that the Duke had seen crack for one unguarded instant in Lady Ashby's drawing room. And now Asherton, having secured his heiress and his fortune, had sent his discarded betrothed an engraved invitation to the wedding, to sit among the guests and watch him marry the woman he had traded her for, to provide the assembled county with the final delicious spectacle of her humiliation, to put the period to a ruin in the most public manner imaginable. It was not enough to have wronged her. He wished to enjoy the wronging. He wished to display it like a trophy. The Duke set down the last of the reports and stood for a long while at his window, and he was aware that he was angrier than the matter, by any reasonable measure, warranted. He had no claim upon Lenora Sayer. He had met her once. The world was full of cruelties greater than this, and he had hardened himself against most of them years ago, for a man who feels every injustice keenly does not survive the world the Duke had survived, and yet he had seen the iron in her, and he had recognized it, and he found that he could not endure the thought of Lord Frederick Asherton enjoying his triumph in a fortnight's time. There was, beneath the cold strategy that came so naturally to him, something hotter and less governable, and he did not entirely trust it, and he did not entirely wish to. He encountered her again 3 days later, and this time it was not by his design, which unsettled him further, for he had not arranged it, and could not, therefore, pretend that it was business. It was at the Lending Library on Merrow Street, an unfashionable establishment that the Duke patronized precisely because the fashionable did not, and where he could browse the shelves of history and natural philosophy without being accosted by matchmaking mothers. He came around a tall case of books and found Lenora Sayer standing in the narrow aisle, a volume open in her gloved hands, and she was so absorbed that she did not at first perceive him, and so he had a moment to observe her unguarded. She was reading poetry. He could see the shape of the lines on the page, and her face, bent over the book, was not the still iron mask she wore in company, but something softer and sadder and infinitely more alive, a face caught in the act of feeling, which she permitted herself only when she believed herself unobserved. He found the sight of it did something to him that he had no language for, and that frightened him, and he very nearly withdrew without speaking. But she looked up. "Your Grace," she said, and the iron came down at once over her features, the practiced composure sliding into place like a visor, but not quite quickly enough. He had seen the softness, and she knew he had seen it, and a faint colour rose in her cheeks. "I did not look to find the Iron Duke of Drakemoor among the poetry." "No one does," the Duke said. "It is the chief advantage of the place. I am reliably informed that I have no soul whatsoever, and a man with no soul cannot be expected to read verse, and so no one comes here to find me, and I am left in peace. You have, I fear, discovered my secret. I shall have to ruin you to ensure your silence." The ghost of a smile touched her mouth, fuller, this time, than the one she had given him at the door. "I am already ruined, Your Grace. You are some weeks too late to do the office. You will have to content yourself with my gratitude instead." "Gratitude," the Duke repeated, and he found he did not like the word. "For what, pray?" "For Lady Ashby's, for crossing the room. I have had a great deal of time these last days to consider why you did it, and I confess I have not arrived at a satisfactory answer, but I have decided to be grateful nonetheless. It is a more comfortable feeling than suspicion, and I have had quite enough of suspicion." She closed her book over one gloved finger. "They are all certain you did it to amuse yourself at my expense. I have found, somewhat to my surprise, that I do not believe them." The Duke regarded her steadily. The narrow aisle was very quiet. The dust hung gold in a shaft of window light between the high shelves, and they were quite alone, 2 figures in grey reading a story that neither of them yet understood. "Why do you not believe them?" he asked. He was genuinely curious. He had spent 15 years being precisely the man the world believed him to be, and he wished to know what she had seen that the world had not. She considered the question with the same grave honesty, he had begun to recognize as the deepest thing in her. Because, she said slowly, when you spoke of cowardice, when you said you had a low tolerance for it, your voice changed. Just a moment. A man performing cruelty does not sound like that. I have lately become rather an expert in the sound of cruelty performed as kindness. Lord Asherton has given me a great deal of practice. And you did not sound like him at all. You sounded like a man who meant what he said. She paused. I may be mistaken. I have been mistaken before, and grievously, in the matter of reading a man's heart. But I find I would rather be mistaken in this direction than in the other. It is the only luxury left to me, to choose now and then what I shall believe. The Duke said nothing for a moment. He was aware, with the precise self-knowledge that was both his gift and his curse, that he was in some danger, that this honest, ruined, clear-eyed woman in a dove-grey gown had just looked through 15 years of carefully constructed armor and seen something true beneath it, and had chosen, with full knowledge of the risk, to trust it. No one had done such a thing to him in a very long time. Possibly no one had ever done it. You are not mistaken, he said at last, and his own voice was lower than he intended. It is an unfamiliar circumstance for me, and you must forgive me if I do not bear it gracefully. I am not accustomed to being understood. I have arranged my entire life, at no small expense, to ensure that I never am. Then we are even, Lenora said, for I am not accustomed to being believed. We are both, it seems, somewhat out of our depth, and this time she did smile fully, and it transformed her grave face the way dawn transforms a grey landscape, and the Duke felt the quickening in his chest again, and this time he did not trouble to deny what it was. They talked. He could not afterward have said for how long. They talked of poetry, and then of her father, whom she spoke of with a grief so clean and unashamed that it shamed his own buried sorrows, and then of his brother, whom he had not spoken of aloud to any living soul in 11 years, and whom he found himself, to his own astonishment, describing to her in the dusty gold light of the Marrow Street Library, as though some long-sealed door had been quietly opened. She listened the way she read poetry, wholly, with her whole grave attention, as though what he said mattered. No one had listened to the Iron Duke as though what he said mattered. They listened because they feared him or wanted something from him, and he had learned to read the difference long ago. She wanted nothing, she had nothing left to want, and she listened. When at last she said she must go, he walked her to the door and out into the thin autumn sunlight, and he was aware that he did not wish her to go, and that this was a new and inconvenient sensation, and that the formidable Iron Duke of Drakemoor, terror of 3 kingdoms, was standing on a public street feeling something that he could only honestly describe as reluctance. The wedding, he said abruptly, as she gathered herself to leave. He had not meant to raise it. You mean to attend? The iron flickered back into her face. I must. You know why I must. To refuse is to confess the wound. He is counting on my refusal, or on my coming and breaking. Either would serve his purpose. The only thing he has not prepared for is that I shall come, and that I shall not break. It is a thin sort of victory, but it is the only one available to me, and I find I am not too proud to take it. The Duke looked at her for a long moment in the autumn light, and the thought that had been forming in him for 3 days, the cold strategic thought that was also something far warmer and more dangerous, settled at last into resolution. It need not be so thin a victory as that, he said. Walk with me a little, Miss Sarah. I have a proposal to put to you, and I should like to put it where Lord Asherton's many admirers cannot overhear. They walked together along the quiet length of Marrow Street and into the small green square beyond it, where the plane trees were shedding their gold and a few nursemaids walked the gravel paths, and where the Duke could speak without being overheard by the gossip that attended him everywhere else. He was aware of how they must appear, the dark, formidable Duke and the slight woman in grey, walking slowly beneath the falling leaves, and for once in his life he did not care how he appeared, which was itself a circumstance worth marking. I will escort you to the wedding, he said, on my arm, as my guest, and my particular acquaintance, and under my open protection. You will not arrive as a discarded woman come to be humiliated. You will arrive on the arm of the Iron Duke of Drakemoor, and the entire assembly will be obliged to reconsider, in a single instant, everything they believed they knew about Lenora Sayre. She had stopped walking, she was staring at him, and the iron composure had quite deserted her, and what remained was naked astonishment. You cannot mean it, she said. I never say what I do not mean. It is a great waste of breath, and I have no patience for it. Consider the matter as I have considered it. Ashton has invited you to witness your own ruin made final. He has arranged a theatre and cast you in the part of the fallen woman and assembled an audience to enjoy the performance. Very well, we shall give them a performance, but it shall be ours and not his. You will walk into that church not as the woman he discarded, but as the woman a duke chose, a duke who has refused every ambitious match in the kingdom for 15 years and has now, before all the world, selected the very woman Ashton threw away as worthless. The duke's voice was very even and very cold, and beneath the cold ran something that was not cold at all. Do you understand the size of it, Miss Sayre? It will not merely spare you humiliation, it will turn the whole of it inside out. Ashton will stand at his own altar, marrying his co-heiress for her £40,000, and every soul in that church will be looking not at him and not at his bride, but at you, and they will be thinking that a viscount's foolish hair, in his greed and his blindness, threw over a woman whom a duke found worthy of his arm. His triumph will become his disgrace, and he will have arranged the whole of it himself and invited the witnesses himself, and he will be able to do nothing whatsoever to stop it. Lenora was silent for a long while. The leaves came down between them. He could see her thinking, not with the giddy hope of a woman offered a rescue, but with the careful, wounded calculation of a woman who has learned what it costs to hope and is determined not to be a fool twice. And what, she said at last, very quietly, do you require in return? You will forgive the question, Your Grace. I have learned to ask it. The last man who offered me everything required only that I be convenient and discard easily, and bear the blame when I was no longer wanted. I do not say you are such a man. I have decided to believe you are not, but I have decided also never again to accept a gift without first asking its price. It was, the Duke thought, the most sensible thing he had heard a woman say in 15 years, and it confirmed everything he had begun to feel for her, and it required from him a degree of honesty he was not accustomed to offering anyone. A fair question, he said, and you shall have a fair answer. I require very little. I require that you allow it to be believed, for a time, for the duration of what we might call the campaign, that there is an understanding between us. I do not mean an engagement. I would not presume so far, and I would not have you bound to anything. I mean only that the world should believe the Iron Duke of Drakemoor has taken a particular and serious interest in Miss Lenora Sayre. That belief, once established, will do all the work. It will rehabilitate your name as surely as a royal pardon. It will silence the slander Ashton has spread, for no one will dare repeat that a woman is a scheming fortune hunter, once a duke who needs no fortune has shown her his open favour. Society is a herd, Miss Sayre. It follows whoever leads with the most conviction. I have led it before. I shall enjoy leading it again. And in return, she pressed, for she would have all of it. What do you gain? Forgive me, but a man does not lend his name to a ruined woman for the pleasure of confounding a viscount's heir he has never met. There is a price for you too. There is always a price. What is yours? The Duke stopped walking. They had reached the centre of the little square, beneath the largest of the plane trees, and the gold leaves fell around them, and he turned to face her fully, and he found that the cold strategic answer he had prepared would not come, because it was not the true one, and she of all people in the world deserved the true one. I gain, he said slowly, An end to a fortnight of finding myself unable to think of anything but the grey of your eyes and the particular roughness of your voice, and the fact that you read poetry as though it were a thing happening to you rather than a thing on a page. That is my price, Miss Sarah. I should like to be near you. I have not wished to be near anyone in a very long time, and I find the wish inconvenient, and I have no intention of pretending it away. I offer you my arm at this wedding, because I cannot endure the thought of Asherton's triumph, that is true. But I offer you the rest of it, the campaign, the courtship, whatever name you wish to give it, because I have spent 15 years being the Iron Duke, and I am, for the first time in all of them, weary of the iron, and I should like to spend a little while in the company of the only person who has looked at me and seen the man beneath it. There, you have your price. It is more than I meant to confess, and I shall thank you not to make sport of me for it, for I am very much out of practice, and I do not enjoy the sensation of being a fool. The silence stretched between them. The Duke held himself very still. He had laid down his armor entirely, before a woman who had every reason in the world to distrust the gesture, and he could not predict what she would do with it, and the not knowing was an agony to a man accustomed to controlling every outcome. And then Lenora Sarah did something that no one had done to the Iron Duke of Drakemoor in 11 years. She reached out, in the falling gold light, and laid her gloved hand against his, not as a woman accepting a bargain, but as a woman offering comfort, and her grey eyes were bright. "You are not a fool, Your Grace," she said softly. "You are the least foolish man I have ever known, and I think you may be the loneliest, which is a thing I understand better than I would wish to." She drew a breath. "Yes, I accept. All of it, the arm and the wedding and the campaign, and whatever it is that is happening between us in this absurd little square, which I have not the courage to name, and neither, I suspect, have you. Yes, Damon, I shall walk into that church on your arm, and we shall turn his triumph inside out, and I shall do my very best not to fall in love with you in the process, though I make no promises, for I am told I have shockingly poor judgment in these matters." It was the first time she had spoken his given name. He had not known he had told it to her. He must have, somewhere in the long hour in the library. And the sound of it in her low, rough voice did something to the Iron Duke that no army and no court, and no fortune had ever done. It undid him entirely in the space of a single breath, and he stood beneath the plane tree with the gold leaves coming down and understood that whatever bargain he had thought he was striking, he had already lost it, and was glad. What followed was a fortnight unlike any the Duke had known. He sent his sister's old dressmaker, for he had a married sister, Lady Cresswell, the one person who knew the man beneath the iron, and whom he took at once into his confidence, to wait upon Miss Sarah with bolts of silk and lace, and a commission to dress her as befit the particular acquaintance of a duke. Lenora protested the expense. The Duke overruled her with a flat refusal to discuss it that she found, she admitted, oddly comforting, for he did not make a performance of his generosity as Asherton had once made a performance of his. He simply provided and considered the matter closed and turned the conversation to other things. He took her driving in the park at the fashionable hour, the great Drakemoor carriage with its ducal arms moving slowly down the crowded drive while the whole of society craned to see the woman beside him. He stood up with her at 2 assemblies, partnering her in the dances, his dark, formidable presence at her side rewriting her reputation with every measure of the music. He was seen to laugh, the Iron Duke, who never laughed, at something she said. The story moved through the drawing rooms of the city like fire through dry grass. The Duke of Drakemoor, the cold, unattainable Duke, had set his cap at Sir Edmund Sarah's daughter, the very girl Lord Asherton had cast off. And society, the herd, began at once to follow the conviction of the man who led with the most. The whispers reversed themselves with breathtaking speed. The matrons who had pitied her now sought her acquaintance. The cut direct gave way to the eager bow. And Lenora bore the reversal with the same grave dignity she had borne the ruin, neither triumphant nor bitter, which the Duke watched with a deepening admiration that was rapidly becoming something he no longer pretended to himself was strategy. For it had stopped being strategy almost at once, if it had ever truly been strategy at all. The driving in the park became hours of conversation he looked forward to from the moment he woke. The assemblies became evenings he did not wish to end. He found himself inventing reasons to call at the small house she shared with an elderly aunt. He found himself remembering things to tell her. He found himself, one grey morning, standing before his glass and discovering that he had been smiling at nothing, like a green boy, and that he could not for the life of him make himself stop. Lady Cresswell observed all of this with the merciless affection of an elder sister. "You are in love," she informed him over dinner, 10 days into the campaign, hopelessly. "I have not seen your face do that since you were a boy, before father and the depths and the winter that turned you to stone. I had begun to think it had frozen permanently. I am very glad to find I was wrong." She studied him. "Have you told her?" "I have told her a great deal more than I intended," the Duke said, "and a great deal less than the truth. We have an arrangement. It would not be honourable to take advantage of an arrangement struck under duress." His sister laughed at him, not unkindly. "Damon, you magnificent fool. The poor girl is half in love with you already. Maria saw the two of you at the Hartwell assembly and said it was almost indecent how you looked at one another, like a pair of people drowning very politely. There is no arrangement left. There is only the two of you refusing to say so. Tell her, before the wedding, not after. A woman wants to be chosen for herself, not as the closing move in a campaign against the man who wronged her. Do not let her go into that church believing she is a weapon you are wielding. Let her go in believing she is loved. It is the difference, brother, between a triumph and a marriage." The Duke was silent for a long time after that. His sister, as was her habit, had seen the thing he had been carefully not looking at. The wedding was 3 days off. And he resolved, before the gold candlelight of his own dining room, that whatever he and Lenora Sayer walked into that church having struck, they would walk out of it having become something truer, that he would not the great public reversal eclipse the small private truth, which was that the Iron Duke of Drakemoor had fallen, completely and without reservation and rather to his own astonishment, in love. There was a particular afternoon in that fortnight before the wedding that the Duke would carry with him to the end of his days, though nothing happened in it that the world would have called remarkable. He had called for her in an open carriage to drive in the park, and a fine cold rain had come on suddenly, the way it does in late autumn, and rather than turn back they had ordered the hood raised and gone on, the two of them enclosed in the small dim shelter of it, while the rain drummed on the leather, and the park emptied of every other soul who had come to see and be seen. And in that sudden privacy, with the city blurred to grey beyond the streaming glass, Lenora had told him about her father. Not the public grief she wore in company, the dignified bereavement that society found so affecting, the true thing. She told him about the orchards Sir Edmund had loved, the old varieties of apple he had grafted and tended, and named, the way he had walked the rows in October with his hands clasped behind his back and his face lifted to the light. She told him how he had read to her every night of her childhood, even when she was far too old for it, because neither of them had wished to stop. She told him about the morning she had found him, slumped in his library chair with a book of Greek open on his knee, gone in the night without a sound, his face peaceful, as though he had simply paused in his reading. And she told him, and here her voice had gone very low and rough, and the Duke had held himself perfectly still so as not to break the spell of it. The cruelest part of losing her father had not been Asherton's abandonment that followed hard upon it, but the simple unbearable fact that there was no longer anyone in the world who remembered her as a small girl, no one who had known her mother, no one who could say, "I remember when you were so high." She had become, at 21, the last living keeper of her own history, and the loneliness of that was a thing she had never spoken aloud to a single soul. "And now I have told you," she said, looking out at the rain, which is foolish, for you are practically a stranger, and I have known you a fortnight, and I have just handed you the most private grief of my life, as though it were a calling card. I cannot account for it. I have not wept in front of anyone since the funeral. I do not weep in front of people. It is the one rule I have kept through everything. She turned to him then, and her grey eyes were wet, and she did not look away. And yet here I am, weeping in a carriage at a man I am supposed to be deceiving the county alongside. You are a very dangerous person, Damon. You make a woman forget to keep her armor on. The Duke had taken her hand, then only her hand, only that, and held it between both of his, and said nothing for a long while, 'cause he understood that there was nothing to be said, that she had not told him in order to be comforted, but simply in order to be heard, and that the greatest gift he could give her was to receive it without trying to mend it. And when at last he did speak, it was not to console her, but to confess in turn, for it seemed to him a poor exchange to take so much of her and offer nothing back. I have not spoken my brother's name aloud in 11 years, he said. His name was Edmund, as it happens, as your father's was. I had not marked the coincidence until this moment, and I find it has rather undone me. He looked out at the rain. He was 3 years my elder, and he was everything I was not. Open where I was closed, easy where I was hard, beloved by everyone where I was merely respected. He was to have been the Duke. He should have been the Duke. He would have done it beautifully. The people would have loved him. And he caught a fever in the winter of my 25th year, an ordinary fever, the kind that passes in a week, and it did not pass, and within a fortnight he was gone, and my mother, who had buried my father not 3 months before, simply gave up living, as if she had been waiting only to see which of her men she would lose last. He paused. I inherited a dukedom drowning in my late father's debts, a name on the edge of ruin, and a grief I had no time to feel, for there were creditors at the gate, and 1,000 people dependent on an estate that was failing. So I did not feel it. I put it away. I made myself into iron, because iron was what the situation required, and I told myself it was temporary, that I would let the man out again when the danger had passed. The danger passed years ago. I never let him out. I had quite forgotten he was in there at all, until a woman in dove grey looked at me across Lady Ashby's drawing room as though she could see him. Lenora had turned her hand within his then, so that she was holding him rather than being held, and she had said, very softly, "There you are, then. Edmund's brother. I am glad to make your acquaintance at last. I think your brother would be glad to see you out of doors again, after so long shut up in the dark." And the Duke, in the small, rain-loud shelter of the carriage, with the grey city streaming past unseen, had felt something break open in his chest that had been sealed for 11 years, and it did not hurt the way he had always feared it would. It felt like a window opening in a house that had been shut up too long. It felt like air. That was the afternoon he understood, beyond any further pretense, that he was not conducting a campaign. He was falling in love, completely and irreversibly, with a woman who had been handed to him by the cruelty of another man, and had turned out to be the one thing his whole armoured life had been missing. And he resolved, driving home through the rain with her sleeping at last his shoulder, worn out by the weight of all she had carried alone, that whatever it cost him, whatever the world said, he would not let her go back to being alone. He had been the last keeper of his own grief too. He understood the loneliness she had described better than she could know. And he thought, watching the rain, that perhaps two people who had each been the last keeper of their own histories might become, for one another, the thing neither of them had any longer, someone who remembered, someone who knew, someone who would say, "I was there." The society pages, meanwhile, had worked themselves into a frenzy that would have been comical had it not been so useful. The Duke read the accounts of his own courtship over breakfast with a sardonic eye. He learned that he was transformed by a tender passion, that Miss Sayre was an enchantress who had succeeded where the highest-born beauties of 2 kingdoms had failed, that the romance was the talk of every drawing-room from one end of the county to the other, He learned with particular amusement that several of the very matrons who had pitied Lenora at Lady Ashby's now claimed to have always known there was something special about her, to have championed her in her dark days, to have predicted her triumph all along. Society's memory, the Duke reflected, was a remarkably accommodating organ. It remodeled the past to suit the present with the cheerful shamelessness of a politician. He did not trouble to correct it. Let them rewrite their history. The rewriting served Lenora, and that was all he asked of it. But he marked, beneath the froth, the harder current running, for not everyone was charmed. There were those, the ambitious mothers chief among them, who had spent 15 years throwing their daughters at the Iron Duke, only to watch him choose a ruined baronet's girl with no fortune at all. There were those whose disappointment was curdling into something sorer. He heard the edge of it at his club, in the too careful congratulations, in the inquiries pitched a half-tone wrong. He understood that his choice of Lenora was, to a certain kind of mind, not a romance but an affront, an implicit verdict that all their carefully reared and richly dowered daughters had been found wanting, passed over for a woman society had agreed to despise. Such a verdict does not go unresented. And the Duke, who never stopped reading the weather of a room, understood that the very triumph he was engineering would create its own enemies, and that not all of them would be named Asherton. He said nothing of this to Lenora either. She was happier than he had ever seen her, and the happiness was so new and so hard-won, and so plainly disbelieved by its own bearer, for she kept touching it gingerly, the way one touches a bruise that has stopped hurting to be sure, that he could not bring himself to shadow it with warnings of trouble that had not yet come. He would carry the watching himself. He had carried heavier things. Let her have her fortnight of being simply, uncomplicatedly chosen. The rest would come when it came, and he would be ready for it, and she would never face it alone. The morning of the wedding broke clear and cold, with a hard bright autumn sun that struck fire from the frost on the churchyard yews. Weston's was the grandest church in the county, and Lord Asherton had filled it to the rafters, for he had wished every soul of consequence to witness his triumph, and in his vanity he had not paused to consider that an audience he had assembled to enjoy one spectacle might just as readily be made to enjoy another. The Duke came for her in the great Drakemoor carriage with its 6 matched bays and its ducal arms blazoned on the door, and when he handed her up he found, for the second time in his life, that he had been rendered speechless by Lenora Sayer. The grey gown was gone. Lady Cresswell's dressmaker had clothed her in deep midnight silk shot through with silver, that moved like water and caught the light at every step, and her dark hair was dressed with a string of his own grandmother's pearls. He had sent them that morning with no note, for there was nothing he could have written that the gesture did not say, and at her throat lay a single dark sapphire that matched the silk and brought out the storm grey of her eyes. She did not look like a woman come to be humiliated. She did not even look like the woman he had detained at Lady Ashby's door. She looked like a duchess. She looked, the Duke thought with a sensation very near to vertigo, as though she had been waiting all her life for the world to see her clearly, and the world was about to. "Well, Your Grace," she said, and beneath the composure he could hear the nerves, the cost of what she was about to do. "Shall I serve? Have we any chance at all of confounding them?" "You will not merely confound them," the Duke said quietly. "You will silence them." Lenora, and he took her gloved hand, and he held it, and the carriage had not yet moved, and he found that the thing his sister had told him to say was crowding up in his throat. But there was no time, the church bells were already ringing, and so he said only, "Whatever happens in there, whatever they think they are watching, I want you to know that I am not pretending. Not any more. Not for a single moment of it. Hold to that when you are in there and the whole room is staring. It is the only true thing in the church, and it is yours. Now, let us go and ruin Lord Asherton's wedding day." They came late, by careful design, late enough that the church was full, that every pew was settled, that the assembled county had grown quiet in anticipation of the bride. Asherton himself stood at the altar in his wedding finery, golden and pink and pleased, and Henrietta Caro's £40,000 had bought a great deal of lace and a great many diamonds, and the bride was even now being made ready in the vestry. The murmur of the crowd had begun to settle into the hush before the ceremony. Every soul of consequence in the county was packed into St. Weston's, and they had come, many of them, with the particular hope of seeing how the discarded Miss Sayer would bear her public humiliation, for the invitation's cruelty had been widely understood, and society does love a spectacle of pain. The great doors of the church opened. The Duke felt the whole assembly turn, as one body, expecting the bride, and then he heard it, the sound he had spent a fortnight engineering, the sound of an entire crowded church drawing a single startled breath. For framed in the bright doorway, the cold autumn sun blazing behind them so that they seemed to stand in fire, were not the bride and her father, but the Iron Duke of Drakemoor in his severe black magnificence, and upon his arm, in midnight silk and his grandmother's pearls, with her head high and her grey eyes calm and the sapphire burning at her throat, Lenora Sayer. The silence was total. It was, the Duke thought with cold satisfaction, the most perfect silence he had ever produced, and he had produced a great many in his time. He could see Asherton at the altar, his pink complacent face straining slowly white as he understood what he was looking at. He could see the matrons in the front pews, the ones who had pitied her and then cut her and then fawned over her, their fans frozen halfway to their faces. He could see the whole of the county society he had spent the fortnight reorienting, every one of them now obliged, in a single suspended instant, to reconcile two impossible facts: that this radiant woman on a duke's arm was the ruined fortune hunter they had been told to despise, and that the most powerful and unattainable man in 3 kingdoms had chosen to bring her, openly, gloriously, to the wedding of the very man who had thrown her away. He felt Lenora's hand tighten on his arm, the only sign of what it cost her, and then she did the bravest thing he had ever seen anyone do. She smiled, not in triumph. She was too fine for that. She smiled with a serene and gracious composure, as a great lady smiles upon entering a room she has every right to enter, and she inclined her head to the assembly with perfect courtesy, and she let them look at her, and she did not flinch. And the Duke, walking her slowly down the length of the church to the pew that had been left, with delicious irony, near the very front, for Asherton had wished his discarded betrothed close enough to be seen suffering, felt the whole assembly's understanding curdle and reverse exactly as he had foretold. He could hear it begin behind them, the whisper rising like a tide, that Asherton had thrown over a woman a duke had chosen, that the great Iron Duke of Drakemoor, who had refused the highest matches in the kingdom, had brought Sir Edmund's daughter to this wedding on his own arm, that whatever they had been told about Lenora Sayer, it could not be true, for a duke does not court a fortune hunter, and a duke does not look at a woman the way Drakemoor was looking at this one. The slander Asherton had spent a year cultivating died in that single walk down the aisle, strangled by the plain visible fact of a duke's open devotion. They took their seats. The Duke did not release her hand. He held it, in full view of the church, a thing he had never done with any woman before any audience in his life, and he felt Asherton's white furious gaze fixed upon them from the altar, and he met it, once, with the flat cold look that had unmanned far greater men than Frederick Asherton, and he watched the Viscount's hair look away. The bride came at last. Henrietta Caro processed down the aisle in her mountain of lace and diamonds, and she was a handsome enough young woman, and her £40,000 glittered at her throat and her wrists and in her hair, and not one soul in that church was looking at her. They were looking at Lenora Sayer, serene in midnight silk in the second pew, on the arm of a duke. The bride felt it. The Duke saw her feel it, saw the bewilderment, then the dawning understanding, then the first flush of an anger that would, he suspected, find its way to its target before the day was out. Henrietta Caro had purchased a triumph with her father's coal money, and she had arrived at the altar to find the triumph stolen, the audience's attention captured by another woman entirely, her own wedding transformed into the occasion of her husband's public folly. She would not forgive it. The Duke noted the fact and filed it away, for he was never not calculating even in love. The ceremony proceeded. Asherton stumbled over his vows, a small thing, but the church heard it, and the church understood it, and the whisper rose another notch. He could not keep his eyes from the second pew. Twice during the service the Duke saw him look, helplessly at the woman he had ruined, now restored before his eyes to a glory beyond anything he could ever have given her, and twice the Duke saw on that pink soft face the particular sick expression of a man who has just understood, too late and too publicly, the magnitude of what he threw away. Not love. Asherton had never loved her. He was not capable of it. But the awful retrospective arithmetic of greed, that he had traded a woman a duke wanted for £40,000, and that the whole county was now silently performing that same arithmetic and arriving at the same contemptuous answer. When it was done, when the wretched couple were pronounced man and wife and turned to process back down the aisle as husband and bride, they had to pass the second pew. They had to pass Lenora Sayer on the arm of the Iron Duke of Drakemoor. And the Duke, who had planned a great deal of this morning, watched Lenora do the one thing he had not planned, the thing that was so entirely her own that it made his heart turn over in his chest. As Asherton drew level with their pew, his new wife on his arm and his composure in ruins, Lenora rose. She rose with perfect grace, and she dropped the bride a curtsy of flawless, generous courtesy, and she said, in a voice pitched to carry just far enough, clear and warm and entirely without malice, "My felicitations to you both. I wish you every happiness. Truly, with my whole heart. I have never in my life been so grateful for another woman's good fortune." And then she smiled at Asherton, a kind smile, a forgiving smile, the smile of a woman who has risen so far above an injury that she can afford to be gracious about it, and she sat back down, and she took the Duke's hand again, and Lord Frederick Asherton walked the rest of the way down the aisle of his own wedding burning, with the understanding that he had been not merely outmaneuvered but forgiven, which is the one thing a small soul can never bear. The whisper became a roar the moment the doors closed behind the wedding party. The Duke sat in the emptying church with Lenora's hand in his, and listened to the county society of Two Kingdoms rewrite, in real time and with breathless relish, the entire story of Lenora Sayer, from cautionary tale to romance, from fortune hunter to wronged heroine, from the discarded woman to the Duke's chosen one. It was complete. The campaign had succeeded beyond even his cold expectations. Her name was made, the slander was dead. Asherton's triumph had become, exactly as the Duke had promised, his public disgrace. And the Duke found that he did not care about any of it. He cared only that the woman beside him was trembling very slightly, now that it was over and the cost of her courage could be paid, and that when he covered her hand with both of his, she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a fortnight, and that when she turned to him in the empty pew with the cold sunlight slanting down through the high windows of St. Wyston's, her grey eyes were not triumphant but shining, and wet, and looking at him as though he were the only fixed point in a world that had spent a year trying to break her. "You said," she whispered, in the carriage, "that you were not pretending. Did you mean it, Damon? Truly mean it? Because I find I cannot bear to walk out of this church into all that." She tilted her head at the roaring world beyond the doors, "and not know. I have had enough of not knowing. Tell me the truth, even if it is no. I would rather have a hard truth than a kind lie. I have had a year of kind lies." The Duke looked at her in the empty church, and the thing his sister had told him to say, the thing he had not had time for in the carriage, rose up in him now, in the quiet after the storm, and he found that it was not difficult at all. "I mean it," the Duke said. "I have never meant anything more. Lenora, I came to Lady Ashby's reception to satisfy a creditor's son and to leave within the half hour, and I crossed a crowded room instead, and I did not know why, and I have known why every day since. The campaign was real, but it was never the truth of it. The truth of it is that I am 36 years old, and I buried my heart with my brother 11 winters ago, and I had made my peace with never feeling anything again, and then you stood by a marble pillar and refused to be broken, and you ruined me entirely, and I would not undo it for the kingdom. He drew a breath. I did not bring you here to use you as a weapon against Asherton, whatever I told myself at the start. I brought you here because I could not endure the thought of any man being cruel to you, and because I am selfishly, helplessly in love with you, and because I wished the whole world to see me choose you, not to defeat him, but because choosing you is the truest thing I have ever done, and I wanted witnesses. There, that is the hard truth, and it is not no. It is the furthest thing from no that has ever lived in me. She did not speak, she could not, he saw. But she pressed his hand against her cheek, and her eyes spilled over at last, silent and unashamed, and the cold sunlight made the tears blaze on her face, and in the empty church with the dust hanging gold in the high windows, she let him see her whole, the wound and the iron and the grief and the dangerous, returning hope. And the Duke understood that he had been given a thing he had no right to expect and would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. Then take me out of here, she whispered at last, on your arm, in front of all of them, and do not let go. I have been let go of once, very publicly, and nearly killed me. Do not do it gently and do not do it slowly. Just do not let go. Never, the Duke said. It was a vow, and he made it as he had made the vows that had restored his ruined house, with the whole iron weight of a will that had never once broken its word. Not while I draw breath. You may rely upon it as you would rely upon the sunrise. I do not let go. They walked out together into the churchyard, into the cold bright sun and the waiting crowd, and the county society of two kingdoms before them, and bowed, the deep bows now, the bows owed to a duke and the lady on his arm, and Lenora Sayer walked through the wreckage of the humiliation that had been prepared for her as though through a garden, gracious and luminous and entirely restored, and the Duke walked beside her and did not let go. The weeks that followed were the strangest and the happiest the Duke had ever known, and they were not without their shadows. The about-face of society was total and shameless. The doors that had closed against Lenora flew open. The matrons who had cut her now begged her acquaintance. Invitations to Drakemoor's particular friend arrived by the dozen, and the same drawing rooms that had hummed with her ruin now hummed with her romance. Lenora bore it with a clear-eyed dryness the Duke found endlessly delightful. It is remarkable, she observed to him one afternoon, as yet another fawning note was carried in, how a woman's character improves the instant a Duke takes an interest in it. I had not known I was so good. 6 weeks ago I was a scheming jade. Today I am a paragon. I shall try not to let it go to my head, but it is very tempting to begin lecturing people on virtue, now that I have so unexpectedly acquired so much of it. The Duke laughed, easily now, for she had taught him how, and it no longer felt like a thing rusted shut. They were, by then, openly courting. He called at the little house every day and walked with her and drove with her, and the understanding that had begun as a fiction had become so plain and so real that even the gossips no longer pretended to doubt it. He had not yet asked her formally to be his wife. He was waiting for what? He could not entirely say. Perhaps to be certain she came to him whole and not still bleeding from the old wound. Perhaps because the asking, when it came, must be perfect, and nothing in his life had ever felt so worth the getting right. In the first golden weeks after the wedding of Lord Asherton, for that was how the county had taken to dating things, before and after the day the Iron Duke confounded the church, the Duke discovered the particular pleasure of an open courtship freed at last of any pretense. There was no longer a campaign to maintain, no fiction to uphold. There was only a man and a woman who had told one another the truth in an empty church, and were now permitted, by the whole sanction of society, to learn one another properly. He learned that she rose early and could not abide a late breakfast. He learned that she played the pianoforte not brilliantly but feelingly, which he found he preferred, and that she sang in a low alto that did something to his composure he chose not to examine in company. He learned that she had a temper, well-banked but real, and that it kindled chiefly on behalf of others, a servant spoken to harshly, a child neglected, a kindness withheld where it was owed, and that she had no temper at all for slights against herself, having long since exhausted her capacity to be wounded on her own account. He learned that she was clever in a way that fashionable society neither rewarded nor recognized, a deep, unhurried intelligence that turned over a question the way her father must have turned over his grafts, patiently from every side. He learned that she made him laugh daily, often without intending to, and that he had gone 15 years scarcely laughing at all, and had not known until now how much he had missed it. And she learned him in turn, which was the more remarkable thing, for he had been a closed book to the whole world for so long that he had half forgotten there was anything written inside. She learned to read the small signs of his moods that no one else had bothered to read, the particular stillness that meant he was troubled, the slight softening at the corner of his mouth that was, in him, the equivalent of another man's open joy, the way his hands betrayed what his face concealed. She learned that beneath the iron he was a man of deep and carefully governed feeling, that the coldness the world feared was a discipline and not a nature, and that the discipline had cost him a great deal more than anyone had ever guessed. She did not try to dismantle the discipline. She understood it too well for that, having forged her own. She simply made it, for the first time in 11 years unnecessary, created around herself a small space in which the Iron Duke did not need to be iron, and the man could come out and breathe. They walked a great deal in those weeks. He took her to Drakemoor for the first time, the great estate 2 days' journey from the city, the formidable house of grey stone that had been his fortress and his prison both. He had dreaded showing it to her, half expecting her to see only its grandeur, its cold magnificence, the weight of its history. Instead she saw, within an hour of arriving, the thing he himself had stopped seeing years ago, that it was beautiful, and that it was sad, and that it had been waiting, like its master, for someone to live in it again, rather than merely maintain it. "It is a house in mourning," she said softly, standing in the great empty hall where his ancestors looked down from their dim portraits. "It has been in mourning so long it has forgotten it is allowed to stop." She turned to him. "May I stop it, Damon? When I am mistress here, for I find I am no longer in any doubt that I shall be. You have rather given the game away. May I open the shutters and light the fires and fill it with people laugh? I should so love to. It seems to me a great waste, all this beauty given over to grief. Your brother would not have wanted it kept as a tomb. You said he loved easily. A man who loves easily would want his house to be loved in." The Duke had stood in the cold hall of his ancestors and felt, for the second time, that window opening in the shut-up house of his heart. "You may do anything you wish with it," he had said, when he could trust his voice. "You may tear it down and build it new. I should not care. I have hated this house for 11 years, Lenora. I have lived in it out of duty and dreaded every stone of it. If you can teach it to stop mourning, you will have done a thing I did not believe could be done. You will have done it for the house, and for me, for I think we have been mourning in much the same fashion, the house and I, and for much the same reasons, and neither of us has known how to stop." It was during those weeks at Drakemoor, walking the long autumn gardens and learning the rhythms of one another's company, that the love between them deepened from the bright, sudden flame of the courtship into something slower and stronger and more enduring, the kind of love that is built rather than struck, laid down day by day like the courses of a wall, until one morning you wake and find it has become the structure your whole life rests upon. The Duke had not known such a thing was possible for him. He had thought love, if it came at all, would be the lightning that the poets described, a thing that struck and consumed. He had not understood that the lightning was only the beginning, the spark that lit the fire, and that the fire, once lit, must be tended, fed, kept, and that the tending was itself the deepest pleasure of all. He learned to tend it. He found he was good at it. He had spent 15 years tending a dukedom out of pure cold will. It turned out that the same patient constancy, turned toward a person rather than a fortune, became the warmest thing in the world. Lady Cresswell came to Drakemoor for a week during that golden time, and the Duke had the rare pleasure of watching the two women he loved most fall, swiftly and completely, into the particular alliance of women who recognize one another's quality. His sister, who had watched over his frozen heart for 11 years with a fierce protective despair, watched Lenora thaw it and wept with relief in private and teased her brother mercilessly in public and declared, on the last evening of her visit, that she had not had a sister and had always wanted one, and was very glad her tiresome brother had finally produced one for her, even if it had taken him 36 years and required the assistance of a contemptible viscount to manage it. "You should marry her at once," she told the Duke that night, as they sat alone by the fire after Lenora had retired. "Why are you waiting? You look at her as though the sun rises out of her. She looks at you the same. The whole county knows it. What in heaven's name are you waiting for?" The Duke had considered the fire for a long moment. "I am waiting," he said slowly, "to be certain she comes to me free, not grateful, not rescued, not still half believing herself a charity case I took up out of pity. I will not have her marry me, because I lifted her from ruin and she feels she owes me the rest of her life. I want her to choose me as I chose her, freely for myself, with nothing owed on either side. She is not quite there yet. She still flinches, sometimes, when she is happy, as though waiting for it to be taken back. Until she stops flinching, until she believes in her bones that she is loved and not merely rescued, I will not ask her. When I ask her, I want her yes to be the freest word she has ever spoken." He had paused. "And there is the other matter. I do not think it is finished with Asherton. I have watched that breed of man my whole life. He will not have absorbed the wedding. He will be nursing it. I would rather settle whatever he means to do before I bind her name irrevocably to mine, so that when she becomes my Duchess, she does so into safety and not into the middle of a war." His sister had looked at him with particular exasperated tenderness of an elder sibling. "You are protecting her even from your own happiness. Oh, Damon, you always did insist on carrying everything alone, but you are not alone anymore, you great fool. That is rather the entire point of what has happened to you. Let her help carry it. She is stronger than you think, and she is tired, I suspect, of being protected. The wounded do not want to be shielded forever. At some point they want to be trusted to stand." She had risen and kissed his brow and gone up to bed, and left him alone with the fire and the warning he was not ready to heed, for the Duke had spent 11 years certain that the only safe way to love a thing was to stand between it and the world, and it would take a wound he did not yet see coming to teach him that there are some battles the beloved must be allowed to share, and that the shield held too jealously becomes, in the end, a wall. But the wound was not entirely healed, and the past was not entirely done with them, and the Duke, who never stopped calculating even in his happiness, had marked two faces in the crowd outside St. Dunstan's that he did not trust. The first was Asherton's. The Viscount's heir had walked out of his own wedding humiliated, and the Duke knew the breed too well to imagine he would let the injury lie. A bigger man absorbs a defeat and grows from it. A small man nurses it and feeds it and waits. Asherton was a small man with a coal fortune now at his disposal, and a wife, and wounded vanity, and the Duke knew that the matter was not finished, whatever the world believed. The second face was the bride's. Henrietta Carow, Henrietta Asherton, now had purchased a triumph and been handed a humiliation, and the Duke had seen at the altar the precise moment her bewilderment hardened into a cold and capable anger. He had taken her measure. She was not, he judged, a clever woman, but she was a determined one, and she had a vast fortune and a wounded pride and a husband eager to lay the blame for his disgrace at any door but his own. The two of them together, the resentful Viscount and the slighted heiress, made exactly the kind of small, dangerous alliance that the Duke had spent his life learning to dismantle. He did not speak of his unease to Lenora. He did not wish to dim her happiness with shadows that might never fall. But he watched, and he waited, and he set certain quiet inquiries in motion, for the Iron Duke did not believe in leaving an enemy's intentions to chance. The blow, when it came obliquely, as such blows always do. It began as a whisper, the very weapon Asherton had used before, and the only one available to a coward. The Duke first caught the scent of it at his club, where an acquaintance, with the false delicacy of a man who enjoys delivering bad news, inquired whether there was any truth in the curious story going about concerning Miss Sarah and the disposition of her late father's debts. The Duke, who could read a face the way other men read print, said nothing and learned everything. There was a story going about. It concerned Lenora, and it was being put about deliberately, with care, by someone who knew exactly how to wound her. He ran it to ground within 2 days, for he had not built his fortune by being slow. The story was this, that Sir Edmund Sarah's debts had been larger than was known, that Lenora had concealed their true extent, that she had in fact certain properties of her late father's under conditions that were, the word was always whispered, never spoken plainly, irregular, that the woman the Iron Duke had so gallantly raised up was no wronged innocent she appeared, but a clever and dishonest creature who had deceived one fiancée about her circumstances, and was now in a fair way to deceive a duke. It was Asherton's old slander given new and more dangerous form, no longer that she had hidden her poverty, but that she had committed something near to fraud, and it was salted with just enough invented detail, just enough false document and misremembered date to make it stick. The Duke understood at once what it was, and who had made it and why. Asherton had the coal fortune now, and could afford to buy the testimony of a dishonest clerk or two. Henrietta had the malice. Together they had manufactured a respectable-seeming scandal designed to do the one thing that could still hurt Lenora, to make the Duke doubt her. For if the Iron Duke could be brought to believe that the woman he loved had deceived him about her father's affairs, that she had hidden a fraud beneath her dignified suffering, then the whole glorious reversal of the wedding would collapse. The county would say the Duke had been taken in. Lenora would be ruined a second time and more completely, and Asherton would have his triumph after all, restored and doubled. It was, the Duke acknowledged grimly, a genuinely clever scheme, far cleverer than he would have credited the Viscount with, which told him Henrietta's cold determination was the true engine of it. And it nearly worked. Not because the Duke believed it. He did not for a single instant. He knew Lenora's honesty the way he knew the weight of his own hand. It nearly worked because of how it reached Lenora herself. For someone, and the Duke would learn later that it was Henrietta's own doing, a final cruelty added for the pleasure of it, arranged for Lenora to overhear 2 gossiping women at a musical evening repeating the slander, and to overhear immediately after a 3rd woman say, with the casual brutality of the well-fed, "Well, and we shall see now whether Drakemoor stands by her, or whether he was only amusing himself after all." A man like that does not marry a woman under a cloud. I dare say he will find a graceful way to withdraw, and who could blame him? He has his name to think of, and Lenora, who had been let go of once very publicly by a man who had sworn to love her, who had built her hard-won peace on the Duke's promise not to let go, who carried beneath all her iron the deep and reasonable terror of every wounded person, that the love which seemed too good must inevitably prove false. Lenora heard it, and believed in the cold, lonely hours that followed that it might be true. She did not come to him with it. That was the heart of the wound. The old terror told her that to face him with the question would be to invite the rejection, to hear from his own mouth the graceful withdrawal the woman had predicted, and so she did what the wounded do, and tried to spare herself the blow by anticipating it. She wrote him a letter. The Duke received it the next morning, and read it standing at his window in the grey dawn, and felt the bottom drop out of his happiness. It was a brave letter, and a terrible one. She released him. She had heard, she wrote, the things being said. She would not have him bound to a woman under such a cloud, whatever the truth of it, for his name was worth more than her happiness, and she would not be the instrument of his disgrace as she had been, all unwilling, the instrument of Asherton's. She thanked him, and here the Duke had to set the letter down for a moment, for his hand was not steady. She thanked him for having given her, however briefly, the experience of being chosen, which she would treasure all her life, and which had been worth any price it now cost her to relinquish. She released him from every promise. She asked him not to call again. She signed it, simply, Lenora, and the absence of any softer word was the most painful thing in the whole painful page. The Duke stood at his window in the grey light with the letter in his hand, and the old iron rose in him, but it was a different iron now, not the cold armor he had worn for 15 years against a world he expected nothing from, but the hot forged iron of a man who has at last found the one thing he will not lose, and who has just discovered that someone has tried to take it from him. He did not feel despair. He felt, rising through the grief, a cold and absolute fury, and beneath the fury a perfect clarity. He understood the whole shape of it now, the manufactured scandal, the arranged overhearing, the calculated cruelty of letting a wounded woman wound herself. Asherton and his bride had not merely struck at Lenora. They had reached into the one private true thing the Duke possessed and tried to poison it, and they had counted on her fear and his pride to do their work for them, so that the two lovers would destroy with their own hands what no enemy could destroy from without. They had miscalculated. They did not know the Iron Duke of Drakemoor. They had taken him for a man who would withdraw to protect his name. They did not understand that he had spent 15 years building a name precisely so that he would one day have the power to protect something that mattered, and that the something had finally arrived, and that he would burn the whole edifice of his reputation to the ground before he would let go of Lenora Serra. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket over his heart, and rang for his carriage. He went to her first, before he went hunting, because the wound to her was the wound that mattered, and a campaign meant nothing if the woman it was fought for went on believing herself unloved. He found her in the little parlour of her aunt's house, and she had not slept. He could see it in the bruised shadows beneath her grey eyes, and in the rigid composure she summoned when the maid announced him, the iron coming down over a face that had clearly spent the night in grief. She rose. She did not come to him. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, and he heard what the steadiness cost. "I asked you not to call. I had hoped you would let me keep at least the dignity of having released you first. It is the only thing I have left that is mine to give, and I find I wanted very much to give it cleanly." "Sit down, Lenora," the Duke said, gently, "before you fall down, for you have not slept, and neither have I, and we are neither of us at our best for a quarrel. I have read your letter. I have it here." He touched his breast pocket. "I shall keep it always, because it is the bravest and the most wrong-headed thing anyone has ever written to me, and because it tells me, more plainly than anything you have ever said, exactly how badly you have been hurt, and exactly how much you love me, for a woman does not try to free a man she does not love. She tries to keep him. You tried to free me. I have been turning that over since dawn, and I find it has quite undone the last of my reserve." She had gone very still. "You should not have come. You do not understand what is being said." "I understand it better than you do," the Duke said. "I understand it far better than you do, because I have spent 2 days running it to its source, while you have spent 2 nights believing it. Sit down, and I shall tell you the whole of it, and then you shall decide whether you still wish to release me, though I warn you fairly that I shall refuse to be released, for I have already told you I do not let go, and I am a man who keeps his word with a tedious consistency that has made me very difficult to do business with." She sat, slowly. The iron wavered, and the Duke sat across from her, and he laid it all out, plainly and without mercy. The manufactured scandal, the bought clerks, the false documents, the deliberate poisoning of her name with the specific aim of making him doubt her. He told her of the arranged overhearing, of the woman positioned to predict his graceful withdrawal, of the cold cleverness with which the trap had been built to make her wound herself, so that the lovers would do the enemy's work. And he watched her face change as she understood, watched the grief give way to a dawning, terrible comprehension, and then to a shame at her own doubt, and then slowly to something he was very glad to see, which was anger. "They made me believe it," she whispered, They arranged for me to hear it. They counted on her voice cracked, on my believing that I was not worth keeping, that you would leave, as he left. They knew exactly where I was broken, and they put their thumb in the wound. She looked up at him, and the grey eyes were no longer dull with grief, but bright and hard. How they must have enjoyed it. Sitting at home, imagining me reading the slander and writing you my brave little letter of release, exactly as they planned, imagining you reading it and being glad of the easy escape. They imagined wrong, the Duke said, on every count. But here is the thing I most need you to hear, Lenora, before we speak of anything else, before we speak of revenge or vindication or any of it. He leaned forward, and he took her hands, and he held them, and he made his voice as plain and as true as he knew how. I did not believe it. Not for one instant, not for the space of a single breath. When the first whisper reached me at my club, my only thought was to learn who had made it, because I knew, the way I know my own name, that it was false. I do not doubt you. I am not capable of doubting you. They built their entire scheme upon the foundation that the Iron Duke would believe a clerk's forged ledger over the woman he loves, and they could not have understood me less. I would believe you against the testimony of angels. Do you hear me? There is no document in the world that could make me doubt your honor, because I have seen your honor. I have watched it hold when everything was taken from you, and I trust it more than I trust my own eyes. She was weeping now, silently, the tears running down without any change in her face, the way she wept, and the Duke rose and crossed to her and knelt before her chair, which the Iron Duke of Drakemoor had not done before any living soul in his adult life, and he took her weeping face in both his hands. You released me, he said, to spare me. It is the most loving thing anyone has ever done for me, and I shall honor it by refusing it absolutely. I do not want to be spared. I want you. I wanted you under a cloud. I wanted you when the whole county despised you. I wanted you in dove grey by a marble pillar before I knew your name. And I want you now, slandered and sleepless and trying to be noble at me. And I shall go on wanting you when this is over, and the slander is dust, and the people who made it are humbled, which they will be, I promise you very thoroughly. Marry me, Lenora. I had meant to ask you beautifully, in some setting worthy of it, with the right words prepared. I find I cannot wait for the right words. I am asking you on my knees in your aunt's parlour with my voice unsteady, because the thought of you spending one more night believing yourself unwanted is more than I can bear. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that some promises are kept. For a long moment she could not speak at all, and then she did the thing he had hoped for and feared to expect. She slid down from the chair into his arms, there on the parlour floor, and she pressed her wet face into his shoulder, and she said, in a voice muffled and broken and entirely sure, yes. Yes, Damon, you impossible, magnificent man, yes. I should have come to you. I should have trusted you. I am so very sorry that I did not. It came to it in the end. The Duke said into her hair, we both did. It is enough. It is more than enough. Now. And he drew back and held her face again, and there was a new light in his dark eyes, the cold, bright light that had unmanned kings. We have a wedding to arrange, you and I, and a great deal of happiness ahead of us. But first, my love, before any of that, we have a Viscount and his bride to attend to. They reached into the one true thing I possess and tried to break it. They made you weep. I am not, as you may have gathered, a forgiving man. Lenora, will you do me the honor of letting me show them, very precisely, what it costs to be cruel to the woman the Iron Duke of Drakemoor intends to make his Duchess? And Lenora Sarah, on the floor of her aunt's parlour, in the circle of his arms, lifted her streaked face and laughed, a real laugh, the first in days, fierce and bright, and said, oh yes, yes, I rather think I will. I have been gracious and forgiving for a year, Damon, and it has gained me nothing but more cruelty. I find I have a sudden appetite to watch you be the Iron Duke. Show me. Show them. I shall enjoy it more than is strictly Christian, and I shall not repent of it in the slightest. So the Duke set his machine in motion, and it was a thing of cold and beautiful precision, and Lenora watched it with a fierce admiring delight that he found, frankly, intoxicating. He had, in 2 days of inquiry, already learned more than Asherton could have dreamed. For the scheme had a flaw, as the schemes of small men always do. It required accomplices, and accomplices can be bought, and a viscount's new coal money, however vast, could not outbid the resources of a duke who had spent 15 years cultivating exactly the network of clerks and stewards and men of business that such a scheme depended upon. The Duke had found the clerk who had forged the ledger entries. He had found the steward who had carried the false documents. He had found, most damningly, the trail of payments for Asherton, in his vanity and his haste, had been careless, and Henrietta, in her determination, had not troubled to cover the money's path, never imagining that anyone would dare to trace the affairs of a coal heiress. The Duke had traced them. He had every name, every date, every banknote. He had, in short, the complete and documented proof that the scandal against Lenora Sayer was a deliberate and coordinated fabrication, manufactured by Lord and Lady Asherton, with bought witnesses and forged papers, for the express purpose of destroying an innocent woman's good name. And he held all of it quietly, and he chose his moment, for the Iron Duke understood that vindication delivered privately is merely justice, but vindication delivered publicly, before the same society that had enjoyed her humiliation, is something far more satisfying. It is restoration. He would not merely clear her name. He would clear it before the whole assembled county, in such a manner that the cruelty would rebound entirely upon its authors, and Lenora Sayer would be raised so high that no whisper would ever dare touch her again. The occasion presented itself with an almost providential neatness. Lady Cresswell, the Duke's sister, gave a great ball each autumn that no one of consequence in the county would dream of missing, and Lord and Lady Asherton, newly married and newly furious and entirely unaware that their scheme had been laid bare, would certainly attend, for to absent themselves would be to confess defeat. They would come to triumph. They would come to watch the slander do its work, to see the Duke cool toward his ruined favourite, to enjoy the fruits of their cleverness. They would come, in short, to exactly the place where the Iron Duke intended to undo them. He sent his sister's invitation with a note, and his sister, who loved him and loved a spectacle in equal measure, read his intention between the lines and wrote back a single delighted line: "Bring your proofs and your lady, brother, and I shall provide the audience. I have wanted to see those two humbled since the wedding. Let us give the county an autumn ball they shall describe to their grandchildren." In the days between the engagement struck on her aunt's parlour floor and the night of Lady Cresswell's ball, the Duke set himself to found more delicate and more important than any campaign of evidence. He set himself to mending what the slander had cracked, which was not Lenora's name, that he could repair with documents, but her newly hard-won faith that she would not, this time, be let go. For the wound the Ashertons had aimed at was an old one, older than their malice, and the Duke understood that it could not be healed by a single declaration on a parlour floor, however heartfelt. It had been laid down in her years ago, the conviction that love offered to her would prove false. Asherton had not created it, but confirmed it, and the slander had reopened it, and a thing reopened so many times does not close at a word. It closes only at the slow accumulation of evidence to the contrary, the daily, unglamorous, unwavering proof that the man who said he would stay stayed. The Duke understood this. He had his own version of it. He had spent 11 years braced for every good thing to be taken, and he knew from the inside that such a bracing yields not to argument, but only to time and to constancy, and to the patient refusal of the beloved to be braced against any longer. So he did not press her toward the wedding. He came every day as before, but he came differently. He came as a man courting a woman he had already won, which is a rarer and more tender thing than courting one he is trying to win. He brought her no grand gifts. He had learned that grand gifts frightened her, smelling too much of the transactional. He brought her instead small things that proved he had been listening. A particular edition of the poems she had mentioned loving as a girl, hunted down through 3 booksellers, a cutting from one of her father's apple varieties, which he had sent a man to the old Sayre orchard to obtain, that she might plant it at Drakemoor, and have her father's trees about her in her new home. It was this last that undid her composure entirely. She had wept over the slip of green wood in its damp wrapping, not the controlled silent weeping he had seen before, but a real storm of it, the kind that empties a person, and he had held her through it without a word, and understood that he had given her, in a cutting of apple wood, something no diamond could have purchased, the proof that her old life was not to be erased by her new one, but carried into it, honoured, kept. "You thought of my father's trees," she said at last, when the storm had passed, her face pressed to his coat, "of all the things in the world. You thought that I should want his trees." She drew back and looked at him, and her grey eyes were swollen and her face was blotched, and she had never, the Duke thought, looked more beautiful. "I have spent these days half waiting, you know, even now, even after the parlour. Some small cold voice in me kept whispering that you would think better of it, that a duke does not marry a woman the county has twice tried to ruin, that I should not let myself believe it until the ring was actually on my hand. I am ashamed of the voice. But it is there, and I will not lie to you about it, for I am done with managing what I let you see. It is there, and it is afraid, and it has been afraid a very long time." "I know it is there," the Duke said. "I have one of my own. Mine whispers that the only safe way to keep a thing is to lock it away where the world cannot reach it, that if I let myself need you, the world will see the need and take you, as it took my brother and my mother, as it takes everything a man is fool enough to love openly. My voice and your voice are cousins, Lenora. They were both taught the same lesson by the same teacher, which is grief, and they both learned it too well." He took her hands. "We cannot argue them into silence, yours and mine. I have tried. It does not work. But I have come to think they grow quieter, in time, when they are proved wrong often enough. So that is what I mean to do. I mean to prove them wrong every day for the rest of our lives, until your cold voice and my cold voice both grow so tired of being mistaken that they give it up at last and let us be. It may take years. I find I do not mind. I have nothing I would rather spend the years on." It was during these same days that he told her the whole of his plan for the ball, not asking her leave, exactly, for he would have done it regardless, but laying it before her openly, every piece of it, the confessions and the banknotes and the clerk he meant to produce, because he had learned his lesson in the matter of the letter, and would never again carry a danger alone that was rightly hers to share. And he asked her, plainly, whether she wished it done. "It will be public," he warned her. "I will not be able to soften it. To clear you completely, I must expose them completely, before the whole assembled county, and it will not be gentle, and you will have to stand beside me while it is done, and be looked at by everyone in the room. I can do it more quietly, if you would rather, clear your name through the lawyers, privately, without the spectacle. It would be enough to protect you. It would simply be less. The choice is yours, Lenora, and I mean that, not mine. Yours. You are the one who was wronged. You shall decide how the wrong is answered." She had considered it for a long time, with the grave, unhurried attention he loved, turning it over from every side as her father had turned his grafts. And when she answered, there was iron in her voice, but it was warm iron now, the iron of a woman who has been given back her own agency and means to use it. "Do it publicly," she said. "Do all of it. I have spent a year being talked about and not once been permitted to answer. I have swallowed every whisper and worn every slight and held my tongue and kept my dignity, and where has it got me? Twice ruined. No, Damon, I am finished with silence. Let them all be there. Let them see the proof with their own eyes and hear it from the clerk's own mouth. I do not want it done in a lawyer's office where no one can see. I want it done in the light, before every soul who ever enjoyed my shame, so that there can never again be the smallest doubt. so that the matter is closed so loudly that no whisper will ever dare to reopen it. She paused, and something fierce and bright came into her face. And I will stand beside you while it is done, and I will not flinch, and I will look every one of them in the eye. I am rather looking forward to it, if you want the truth. I have been gracious for a very long time. I find I have earned the right, just once, to be vindicated out loud. The Duke had looked at her then with a pride so fierce it was almost pain. There she is, he said softly. There is the woman I saw by the marble pillar, standing. My sister told me the wounded do not wish to be shielded forever, that at some point they wish to be trusted to stand. I did not understand her, quite, when she said it. I understand her now. He raised Leonora's hand and pressed his lips to it. Then we shall do it in the light, you and I, together, and we shall close the matter so loudly that the echo of it will keep you safe for the rest of your days. And when it is done, when the cruel are humbled and the slander is dust and you are vindicated before them all, I am going to marry you, Leonora Sayer, in the chapel at Drakemoor, beneath your father's trees if I have to plant a forest of them by spring, and your cold voice and mine may protest all they like, for we shall be far too happy to attend to them. She had laughed at that, the fierce bright laugh he had come to live for, and the last of the shadow seemed to lift from her face, and the Duke understood that the slander had failed at the deepest level of all, that the Ashertons, in trying to break the two lovers apart, had instead welded them the more firmly together, had given them the one thing their happiness had still lacked, which was a trial survived in common. They had been before two people falling in love. They were now two people who had been struck at, together, and had not broken, and had not let go. That was a stronger bond than any courtship could have forged, and the Ashertons had forged it for them, all unwitting in their malice. There was a justice in that too, the Duke thought, which pleased him enormously, that the cruel, in their cruelty, so often build the very thing they meant to destroy. Lady Cresswell's autumn ball was the most magnificent the county had seen in a decade, and everyone understood why before they had so much as crossed the threshold. The great house blazed with the light of 1,000 candles. The long ballroom glittered with crystal and gold, and the whole of society had come, scenting drama in the air the way they always did, certain that something was to happen and determined to be present when it did. They did not know what. They knew only that the Iron Duke of Drakemoor had been seen, grim and purposeful, about a great deal of quiet business, that Miss Sayer had been absent from society for a fortnight, and was rumoured to be under a fresh cloud, and that Lord and Lady Asherton had accepted their invitations with conspicuous eagerness. The room hummed with anticipation. It was, the Duke reflected as he surveyed it from the head of the great staircase, very nearly the same audience that had filled St. Weston's. They had come to see one spectacle. They would see another. He came down the staircase with Leonora on his arm, and once again the room turned to look, and once again he felt the collective indrawn breath, for she was magnificent. Lady Cresswell's dressmaker had outdone even the wedding. Leonora wore deep crimson silk this time, the colour of resolve, the colour of blood and roses, and the Drakemoor diamonds, for the Duke had brought out the family stones, the great parure that had not been worn since his mother's death, and had clasped them about her throat with his own hands that evening, before the glass, in a moment that had felt more like a vow than anything the church could offer. She blazed. She did not look like a woman under a cloud. She looked like a woman about to be vindicated, which she was, and she carried herself with a serene certainty that came, the Duke knew, from the simple fact that she was loved, and knew it, and would never again be made to doubt it. The Ashertons were there. He found them at once, near the centre of the room, Asherton golden and pink and already a little flushed with wine, Henrietta cold and watchful in a gown that cost more than it flattered. He saw them mark Leonora's entrance, saw their faces curdle with the particular displeasure of people who had expected to find their victim diminished, and found her instead glittering with ducal diamonds on the arm of the man their scheme had been designed to drive away. The Duke smiled at them, a small, cold, courteous smile across the length of the brilliant room, and he had the satisfaction of watching Henrietta Asherton go pale, for a clever woman knows the look of a man who holds something she does not expect him to hold. He did not strike at once. He let the ball unfold. He danced with Lenora. He let the county see them happy and easy and entirely unbothered by any cloud, which itself began to set the whisper running in a new direction. And then, when the supper hour drew the whole assembly together into the great room, when the floor was full and the candles were at their brightest and the audience was complete, Lady Cresswell, who had a fine sense of theatre, called for quiet and announced that the Duke, her brother, wished to say a few words. The Iron Duke of Drakemoor did not, as a rule, make speeches. The room understood at once that something extraordinary was beginning and fell utterly silent, and he let the silence hang for a moment, as he had let the silence hang in St. Wyston's, for he understood the uses of silence as well as any man alive. "My friends," he said, and his voice carried to the furthest corner of the great room, without his seeming to raise it at all. "I am not a man much given to public speaking, and you will be relieved to hear I do not intend to develop the habit. But there is a matter I find I must lay before you here, tonight, before this particular company, for the company is, I think, exactly the right one, and the matter concerns the honour of a lady, and I am old-fashioned enough to believe that a lady's honour is worth a great deal of trouble to defend." He felt Lenora go still beside him. He had not told her the precise shape of what he meant to do. He had told her only to trust him, and she had, and he felt the trust now like a warmth at his side. "Some weeks ago," the Duke went on, "a story began to circulate concerning Miss Lenora Sayer, whom you all know, and whom many of you were good enough to pity not so long ago, and to admire more recently, with that admirable flexibility our society shows in these matters." A ripple of uneasy laughter. He had named their fickleness to their faces, and pleasantly, and they did not quite know how to take it. The story held that Miss Sayer had concealed the true extent of her late father's debts, that she had dealt dishonestly in the settlement of his estate, that she was, in short, not the wronged and honourable woman she appeared, but a deceiver. I dare say most of you have heard some version of it. I dare say some of you half believed it. That is no shame to you. It was very cleverly made. It was made, in fact, more cleverly than I would have credited, and that cleverness is the reason I stand before you now, for I do not let a slander against the woman I intend to marry pass unanswered, and I have spent the past fortnight, with the resources at my disposal, answering it. The silence in the room had changed. It had become the held breath of an audience that knows it is about to witness something it will talk of for years. "I am a thorough man," the Duke said. "I am told it is among my less charming qualities. When I am told a thing, I prefer to verify it, and so when I was told that Miss Sayer had forged documents and concealed frauds, I did what any thorough man would do. I examined the documents. And I found them forged, but not by Miss Sayer. I found the clerk who forged them. He has made a full and signed confession. I have it here." The Duke drew a folded paper from his coat, and the candlelight caught it, and the whole room stared. "I found the steward who carried the false papers about the county and whispered the false story into willing ears. He too has confessed. I have his statement also. And I found my friends, for the makers of this scheme were vain enough to imagine no one would dare to look. I found the record of the payments, every banknote, every date, the complete and documented proof of who manufactured this slander, and what they paid for it, and to what end." He let the silence stretch to its breaking point. Across the room Lord Asherton had gone the colour of ash, and Henrietta had taken her husband's arm in a grip the Duke could see whitening her knuckles even from where he stood. "I shall not name them," the Duke said softly, and the softness was more terrible than any shout. "I find I do not need to. I have placed the full evidence, the confessions, the banknotes, the whole sordid record, in the hands of my solicitors, and copies with 3 gentlemen of unimpeachable standing whom you all know, that there may be no possibility of its suppression. Any person who wishes to satisfy himself of the truth may examine it at his leisure. The makers of this slander know who they are. They know that I know. And they know, for I am, as I have said, a thorough man, and I do not do these things by halves, that I am fully prepared to pursue the matter to its uttermost end, in the courts and out of them, with the entire weight of my name and my fortune, should so much as one further whisper ever again touch the honor of Miss Lenora Sayre. I trust I make myself understood. He did. The room understood perfectly. And though he had named no names, every eye in that brilliant ball-room, slowly, as if drawn by a single invisible thread, toward the place near the center of the floor where Lord and Lady Asherton stood frozen and ashen and utterly exposed, for the room had not needed to be told. The room had known the source of the old slander, and now it knew the source of the new, and it performed the cruel arithmetic of society in an instant, and it rendered its verdict in the only currency society possesses. It withdrew. The couples nearest the Ashertons stepped, almost imperceptibly away. The faces that turned toward them were no longer curious but cold. In the space of a single speech, the whole county had reversed itself a final time, and the man who had jilted Lenora Sayre and the woman who had schemed against her stood alone in the center of a crowded ball-room, surrounded by a widening circle of contempt, humbled before the very society they had assembled to witness their triumph. It was Henrietta who broke. The Duke watched it happen with the cold attention he gave to everything. Asherton, characteristically, only stood and gaped, his soft face working, too cowardly even to deny it. But Henrietta, who had a harder metal in her, lifted her chin and said, into the dreadful silence, in a voice pitched to wound, "And we are all to believe the word of a duke besotted with a fortune hunter. You have bought these confessions as easily as you say we bought our witnesses. This is no proof. This is a powerful man crushing whoever displeases him." It was a brave try. It was, the Duke acknowledged, almost the right move to muddy the water, to suggest that proof and forgery looked alike in the hands of the powerful. In another room, against another man, it might even have served. But the Duke had foreseen it, for he foresaw most things, and he had kept one card in reserve precisely for this moment. "You are quite right, Lady Asherton," he said pleasantly, "that a duke's word might be doubted where money is concerned. I should not expect you to take my proofs on faith. Which is why I asked the clerk who forged your ledgers to attend this evening, that he might answer for himself any question this company cares to put to him." He raised one hand and a side door opened, and a small frightened man in a clerk's black coat was conducted into the room by one of Lady Cresswell's footmen, and he stood there blinking in the candle light, and the whole assembly saw that the Duke had not been bluffing. "Mr. Pell, you forged certain entries in a ledger purporting to detail the affairs of the late Sir Edmund Sayre. Tell the company, if you please, and remember that you have already signed your confession, and that perjury before this many witnesses would go very hard with you, who paid you to do it, and what you were instructed to make the documents prove." And the wretched clerk, trapped and terrified and far more afraid of the Iron Duke than of the Ashertons, told them. He told them all of it, in a thin shaking voice that carried in the dead silence to every corner of the great room, the sum he had been paid, the false entries he had been instructed to make, the story he had been told to support, that Miss Sayre had concealed her father's frauds, and the names of the man and the woman who had hired him. He pointed, with a shaking finger, at Lord and Lady Asherton, and the last possibility of doubt died in the candlelit air, and the county had its verdict confirmed from the mouth of the forger himself, and there was nothing left for the Ashertons to stand on at all. What followed was not violence, for the Iron Duke had no need of violence. It was something far more complete. It was the slow, total, public collapse of two peoples standing in the only world they cared about. Lord Asherton, finding every face turned cold against him, did the one thing left to a coward. He turned upon his wife, there in the center of the ruined ballroom, and said, loud enough to be heard, "This was your doing." You and your money and your endless, and Henrietta, white with fury and shame, turned upon him in return, and the assembled county had the final, exquisite satisfaction of watching the schemers tear at one another, the coheiress and the Viscount's heir, the marriage of £40,000 dissolving into recrimination in full public view, each blaming the other for the disgrace they had so carefully built together. It was, the Duke thought, a more perfect humbling than anything he could have devised. He had only to provide the truth. Their own natures had done the rest. Lady Cresswell, with the impeccable timing of a woman who has run a great house for 20 years, chose that moment to signal the musicians, who struck up a waltz, drowning the squabble in music and giving the company leave to turn their backs upon the Ashertons entirely and resume the ball, which they deaf and a barely concealed glee, leaving the two architects of the slander to gather what remained of their dignity and make their way out through a room that had, in the space of half an hour, decided to forget they existed. They did not stay to dance. There would be no dancing for them in that county again. Within the month, the Duke would learn. They had quitted the neighbourhood altogether under the weight of universal contempt, retreating to some distant property of the coal fortune. Their grand match curdled into a misery of mutual blame. Their cruelty rebounded entirely upon themselves, humbled, decisively and permanently, by the very weapon they had chosen to wield. There is a justice in that, the Duke reflected, which no court could improve upon, that the cruel are most surely undone by their own cruelty, and need only a steady hand to hold up the glass in which they may see it. But the Duke had already forgotten them. He had turned, the instant the waltz began, to the only person in the room who mattered, and he found Lenora standing very still beside him with her grey eyes brilliant, and her composure for once entirely abandoned, looking at him as though he had hung the stars. "You did all of that," she said softly, wonderingly, "for me. You laid the whole of it before the county. You brought the clerk. You, Damon, you have spent a fortnight of your life, and the whole weight of your name to clear the honour of a woman half this room despised a season ago. I do not. I cannot." She stopped and shook her head, and the diamonds flashed at her throat. "No one has ever fought for me. Not once in my life. My father loved me, but he was gentle, and the world rolled over him, and when he died there was no one. I had made my peace with there being no one. And now there is you, who would burn down your own reputation, rather than see one whisper touch me. I do not know what I have done to deserve it." "You stood by a marble pillar," the Duke said, "and refused to be broken, and looked at me as though you saw a man and not a legend. That is what you did to deserve it. That is all it has ever taken." He drew her toward him, there at the edge of the dancing, and the candlelight blazed in the crystal, and the music swelled, and the whole brilliant room turned and dipped around them. "Dance with me, Lenora. The cruel are humbled, and the slander is dust, and you are vindicated before the whole county, exactly as I promised. And I find I have grown very tired of business, and should like very much to simply dance with the woman I am going to marry, in front of all of them, and let them watch, and not care in the slightest what they think." So they danced, and the county watched the Iron Duke of Drakemoor, who had not been seen to smile in 15 years, waltz with Lenora Sayer in her crimson silk and her ducal diamonds, the two of them, slowly beneath the 1,000 candles, with their eyes fixed on one another as though no one else existed in all the world, and the county understood at last that it was watching not a campaign nor a scandal nor a spectacle, but a thing far rarer and far simpler. Two people who had each, against all expectation, found the one person who would never let go. When the waltz ended, the Duke became aware that the night's work had been sealed by a witness he had not arranged for. His own great-aunt, the Dowager Marchioness of Hale, sat near the head of the room in her ancient lace, the most formidable arbiter of society in 2 counties, a woman whose approval could make a reputation and whose displeasure could end one, and who had not been seen at a public ball in years. The Duke had not known she meant to come. Lady Cresswell, it transpired, had invited her in secret, gambling that the old dragon's curiosity would prove stronger than her infirmity, for the Dowager's word was law among exactly the class of person whose opinion could still, even now, do Lenora harm, and to have her present was to have the final seal set upon the night's work. The dowager rose. It took her a moment, leaning on her stick, and the whole room turned to watch her, for when the Marchioness of Hale rose to speak at a public gathering, it was an event that occurred perhaps once in a decade. She fixed the assembly with the cold pale eye that had quelled 3 generations of the ambitious, and she spoke in a voice cracked with age but perfectly clear. "I knew Edmund Sayre," she said, "a better man than most in this room, and a worse manager of money than any, which is to his credit, for it means he was too honest to be cunning. I knew his daughter when she was a girl. I have watched this past year, while this county, which fancies itself so very fine, fell upon a bereaved and innocent young woman like a pack of hounds, on no better evidence than the word of a man who had wronged her and wished to disguise the wronging. I said nothing. I am ashamed to say I said nothing. I am old and I have grown lazy in my courage. But I will not be silent now." She turned her pale eye upon Lenora, and to the astonishment of the entire room, the most formidable woman in 2 counties inclined her head, a small bow, but a real one, the bow of an equal acknowledging an equal. "Miss Sayre, I owe you an apology, and so does every soul in this room who repeated a word against you, and I have the advantage of them in that I am too old to care what it costs my dignity to say so. You have borne a great injustice with a grace that puts the whole of us to shame. I should be honoured, when you are Duchess of Drakemoor, as I understand you shortly shall be, to be received at your table, if you will have an old woman who was too slow to defend you when it might have done some good." The Duke watched Lenora cross the floor to the old Marchioness, for she did cross it at once, with the generous swiftness that was the deepest thing in her, and take the gnarled old hands in both her own, and say something low that brought a brightness to the ancient pale eyes, and he understood that the night's work was complete in a way even his careful planning had not foreseen. For the dowager's apology did what no amount of evidence could have done. It converted Lenora's vindication from a verdict imposed by a powerful man into a welcome extended by the highest authority society possessed. The county would not merely cease to whisper against her. The county would fall over itself to claim her, to befriend her, to have been, all along, her secret champion. And this time the rehabilitation would hold, for it rested now not on the Iron Duke's terrifying favour alone, but on the freely given word of the one woman whose word the county could not dispute. He found her again later, at the long windows at the far end of the ballroom, a little apart from the dancing, looking out at the dark gardens where the lamplight from the house lay in long gold bars across the autumn grass. He came and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the music and the laughter went on behind them, and the night lay quiet and enormous beyond the glass. "It is over," she said at last, softly, as though testing the shape of the words. "Truly over. A year of it, and it is over, and I am standing in a ballroom in your sister's house with your grandmother's diamonds at my throat, and the Marchioness of Hale begging to dine at my table, and I cannot quite make myself believe it is real." She turned to him. "Tell me it is real, Damon. Tell me I shall not wake tomorrow and find it was a dream, and I am still standing by a pillar at Lady Ashby's with an invitation in my hand, and no one in all the world to stand beside me." The Duke took her hand and raised it and pressed it flat against his own chest, over his heart, so that she could feel it beating beneath her palm. "There," he said, "that is real. As real as anything in this world, and it beats for you, and it has beaten for you since the moment you refused to be broken, and it will go on beating for you long after every soul in this ballroom has forgotten there was ever a scandal at all. You will not wake to find it a dream. You will wake tomorrow, and the day after, and 10,000 days after that, and I shall be there each morning, being proved wrong, your cold voice and mine, until they give it up at last. That is the only promise I have ever made that I am entirely certain of keeping. Everything else in my life has been calculation and contingency. This is the one fixed point. You may set the whole weight of your future upon it, and it will hold. And Lenora Sayer stood at the long gold windows with her palm against the Iron Duke's heart, and she believed him at last. He saw it happen, saw the last of the bracing leave her, saw the old cold frightened voice fall silent for the first time in a year, perhaps in many years, and she smiled at him, not the gracious public smile she had worn through all her trials, but a private smile, soft and sure and entirely unafraid, the smile of a woman who has finally come home. They were married in the spring at Drakemoor, in the great chapel of the estate that had so long been a fortress of grief and was now, the Duke found, becoming something he had not dared to hope it could become, a home. The wedding was nothing like Asherton's. There was no gold heiress glitter, no audience assembled to be impressed. There were only the people who truly loved them, Lady Cresswell weeping frankly in the front pew, Lenora's elderly aunt beaming, the old servants of Drakemoor, who had served the Duke's family through the dark years and had not thought to live to see their master happy. Lenora came down the chapel aisle in a gown of pale ivory silk, with the spring light falling through the high windows, and the Duke watched her come and found that the man who had buried his heart 11 winters past had been entirely wrong about himself. The heart had not died. It had only been waiting, all those cold years, for someone worth giving it to. "I, Damon, take thee, Lenora," he said, and his voice did not waver, for he had never in his life been more certain of anything, to have and to hold from this day forward. And he saw her grey eyes fill, and he held her hands tighter, and he finished it not from the prayer book but from his own heart, in a murmur meant only for her, and never, so long as I draw breath, to let go. And Lenora Sayer, who had been jilted and summoned to a tormentor's wedding to be broken, who had instead walked to that church on the armed Duke and walked of it beloved, who had been raised from ruin not as a charity but as a choice, became the Duchess of Drakemoor, and the whole of the county that had once whispered her shame now bowed before her worth, and she carried her new dignity exactly as she had carried her old grief, with grace and warmth and a clear unbroken honesty that in time, the most beloved woman in 3 counties and the despair of every other hostess and the most fiercely life in all the kingdom. The apple cutting from her father's orchard took root that first spring in a sheltered corner of the Drakemoor gardens, and the Duke, who had never in his life taken the slightest interest in horticulture, found himself walking out to it of a morning to see how it did, because she loved it, and because it pleased him beyond all reason to watch the thing grow, a small living piece of her old happiness, transplanted into her new one, putting out leaves in the spring light. In a few years it bore fruit, the old honest variety Sir Edmund had named, and the Duke ate the first apple from it standing beside his wife in the autumn garden, and declared it the finest he had ever tasted, and meant it, though it was small and tart and unfashionable, because everything she had brought into his life had that same quality, plain and true, and worth more than all the hothouse sweetness in the kingdom. In the years that followed, the great house at Drakemoor that had stood so long as a monument to iron and grief became instead a byword for warmth. The Duke and Duchess opened its doors. They kept a generous table. They took in the wronged and the cast-off and the unfortunate, for the Duchess never got what it was to stand alone in a glittering room, and the Duke never refused her anything, and the two of them together did a great deal of quiet good that the world only half knew of. There were young women, in particular, who came to Drakemoor under some cloud or other, jilted, slandered, disgraced by the cruelty of others, and went away again, with their footing restored, for the Duchess had a genius for it, having learned the whole art of restoration from the inside, and more than one good marriage in the county owed its beginning to a quiet word from the woman who had herself been lifted from ruin and never forgot the lifting. The Iron Duke laughed often now, and his people marvelled at it, and grew fond of it, and forgot in time that they had ever feared him. And on autumn afternoons, when the gold light fell long across the park and the leaves came down, the Duke and his Duchess would walk together beneath the plane trees, and sometimes she would read poetry aloud to him in her low, rough voice, and he would listen the way she had once listened to him, wholly, with his whole grave attention, as though every word she spoke were the most important thing in the world, because to him it was. As for Lord and Lady Asherton, the county heard of them now and again, in the way one hears of unpleasant weather in a distant country. Their grand match had soured into a long bitter quarrel, The coal fortune, everything except the regard of the people whose regard they had craved, and they lived out their years in mutual reproach, each blaming the other for night their cruelty was laid bare before the whole assembled society, never quite understanding, for small souls never do, that they had been undone not by the Iron Duke's power but by their own black hearts, and that the woman they had tried twice to break had not merely survived them, but soared so beyond their reach that she scarcely remembered their names. She had forgiven them, in truth, long ago, not out of weakness, but out of the great careless generosity of the genuinely happy, who have no room left in them for old wounds. It was the most complete revenge of all, though she had never intended it as one, that Lenora, Duchess of Drakemoor, beloved and honoured and entirely at peace, simply forgot to go on hating them while they went to their graves remembering her. And the Iron Duke, who had spent 15 years believing that the cold arithmetic of survival was all that life would ever offer him, learned in the warmth of his marriage the one thing his armour had never let him know, that the strongest iron in the world is not the iron that keeps everything out, but the iron of a promise kept, of a hand held, of a vow made before God in a county and never once, in all the long happy years that followed, broken. He had crossed a crowded room once and not known why. He knew why now. He had crossed it because somewhere beneath the legend a man had still been alive, waiting for a woman in dove grey to refuse to be broken, and because some choices, made in a single instant for reasons we cannot name, turn out to be the truest choices of our whole lives, the ones that save us, the ones we would not undo for all the kingdoms of the earth. He had chosen her. He went on choosing her every day for the rest of his life, and he never, so long as he drew breath, let go.